Welcome back to Views with Hughes, agenda-free news. This is Jerome Hughes. Now let's go ahead and get right into it, everyone. All right, now it's time we had a serious discussion about what's happening with The Lord of the Rings of Power Season 2. Okay, now The Lord of the Rings of Power Season 2 has been a massive investment for Amazon, with the Kathleen Kennedy of Amazon, Jennifer Salke, pumping over $1 billion with the hope of creating the next big thing in fantasy television. But everybody, let's face it, when we look at the cold hard numbers for Lord of the Rings of Power Season 2, it's becoming evident that the Lord of the Rings of Power Season 2 isn't delivering the return on investment that Amazon expected. All right. So, according from data from Samba TV, the first episode of The Lord of the Rings of Power Season 2 was watched by only 900,002 U.S. households in its first 5 days. Hang on, I gotta make a correction. It's 902,000 U.S. households. Okay, in just the first 5 days. Now, when we compare this to the first 5 seasons premiere of Lord of the Rings of Power, which was watched by 1.8 million U.S. households in its first 4 days, we see a massive 49.8% decline. Now, that's nearly half the audience of The Lord of the Rings of Power Season 2 gone between seasons. Now, this isn't just a minor dip. This is a drastic drop of that should have been involved. Everyone involved in the Rings of Power Season 2 deeply concerned. But why is this happening to The Lord of the Rings of Power Season 2? Well, to understand, we need to take a look back at the aftermath of The Lord of the Rings of Power, okay, Season 1. Now, after Season 1 wrapped up, Samba TV revealed that while the premiere episode of The Lord of the Rings of Power Season 2's first episodes eventually garnered 3.3 million views in its first 15 days. Now it's Season 1. A significant chunk of the audience didn't stick around, but according to a report by Kim Masters at The Hollywood Reporter, a staggering 63% of viewers who started The Lord of the Rings of Power Season 1 didn't even bother to finish it. That's right, 63% of viewers dropped out, while 37% of viewers stayed for The Lord of the Rings of Power first season before it ended. Okay, now Amazon, like many streaming services, keep their internal data under wraps, but when The Lord of the Rings of Power Season 2 has a completion rate as low as 37%, that's Season 1 actually, in the US, that's not something that can be ignored. Now, even though The Lord of the Rings of Power Season 2, performed slightly better overseas with the 45% completion rate, that's actually Season 1, it's still falling short of the 50% completion rate that insiders say would be considered solid. But for The Lord of the Rings of Power Season 2, solid just isn't good enough for a franchise of this magnitude, okay? So here we are with The Lord of the Rings of Power in its second season, and the numbers don't look good at all. You see, Amazon tried to make a splash with The Lord of the Rings of Power Season 2 and its 3-episode premiere, but the strategy seems to be backfiring. You see, when we actually go ahead and take a look at the IMDb reviews for The Lord of the Rings of Power Season 2, we see a clear trend that people are just tuning in for the first episode of Lord of the Rings of Power Season 2, but then it starts dropping off after that. Now, the first episode of The Lord of the Rings of Power Season 2 has around 8,900 reviews. By the second episode, The Lord of the Rings of Power Season 2, that number drops to 6,800, a 23.59% decline. And by the third episode of Lord of the Rings of Power Season 2, the reviews dropped even further to 6,200, where that's a 30.34% drop from the first episode and a 88.2 drop from the second. Now, the story these numbers tell about The Lord of the Rings of Power Season 2 is troubling. You see, we have to ask ourselves why The Lord of the Rings of Power Season 2, a series with such rich source material and massive budget, is failing to keep its audience engaged. And folks, I think we all know why The Lord of the Rings of Power Season 2 is struggling. Now, we're going to be honest here. The creative direction of The Lord of the Rings of Power Season 2 under the Kathleen Kennedy of Amazon, Jennifer Salke, is the problem, just like, any other problem from any other IP out there. The Lord of the Rings of Power Season 2 seems more focused on pushing in particular woke agenda rather than staying true to the source material itself. Even when they don't have the rights to the source materials, and the fans of the Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power season 2 know and love, when you prioritize the woke ideology over storytelling, this is what happens when you lose your audience for the Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power season 2, point blank. And these are actual Tolkien fans, by the way. Now, the Lord of the Rings of Power season 2 was supposed to be a beloved franchise for a reason. The original works by J.R.R. Tolkien have inspired generations, and the story's universal themes resonate deeply with audiences. But the Lord of the Rings of Power season 2 feels disconnected from the world once again, like season 1, from the world that Tolkien created. Now, the characters in the Lord of the Rings of Power season 2 don't feel like, they belong in Middle Earth, and the storylines in the Lord of the Rings of Power season 2 are just convoluted. Okay, but it's clear that the showrunners of the Lord of the Rings of Power season 2 are more interested in making a political statement than telling a compelling story, and the fans of the Lord of the Rings of Power season 2, they don't see that, but Tolkien fans are noticing. You see, they're tuning out of the Lord of the Rings of Power season 2 because the show itself, the Lord of the Rings of Power season 2, isn't giving them what they came for. And that's something that's not even new. And this particular decline in viewership for the Lord of the Rings of Power season 2 isn't just a problem for Amazon and the Lord of the Rings of Power season 2 itself. It's a warning sign for the entire entertainment industry. Now, audiences everywhere are tired of seeing their favorite franchises like the Lord of the Rings franchise being used as vehicles for woke political messaging. Okay, they actually want good stories, well-developed characters, as well as a respect for the source material from J.R.R. Tolkien himself, which is lacking in the Lord of the Rings of Power season 2. And if the Lord of the Rings of Power season 2 can't deliver that, well, then viewers will continue to walk away from the Lord of the Rings of Power season 2, even though Amazon has 5 seasons laid out and planned. And they're also going to go ahead and find something else. But winning back the audience to have them watch the Lord of the Rings of Power season 2 won't be easy. Now, we've already seen that trust has been broken, and the fans of the Lord of the Rings of Power season 2 can tell that something isn't true to the source material. Now, they've seen what happened to other franchises like Star Wars, Marvel, etc., and they're not going to stick around for another one to be ruined, like the Lord of the Rings franchise with the Lord of the Rings of Power season 2. Now, to put that into perspective, the entertainment landscape is just highly competitive, and if the Lord of the Rings of Power season 2 can't keep its audience, then the audience will move on to something else, of course. And other shows respect their source materials and deliver the kind of storytelling that audiences crave, something that the Lord of the Rings of Power season 2 is actually failing to do. But this particular takeaway from this is clear. Respect the source material of the Lord of the Rings from J.R.R. Tolkien, okay? Don't force the Lord of the Rings of Power season 2 into a mold it was never meant to fit. Matter of fact, might as well just go ahead and cancel the show outright and then get your tax benefits. Otherwise, you risk alienating the very people who made the Lord of the Rings of Power season 2 successful in the first place. Well, I take that back. It's not successful, but the Lord of the Rings itself is successful. Now, the Lord of the Rings of Power season 2 under Jen Psaki is a cautionary tale. It's a reminder that no matter how much money you throw at a project like the Lord of the Rings of Power season 2, if you don't stay true to what made the original great, which is the Lord of the Rings, then the Lord of the Rings of Power season 2 is destined for failure. And right now, that's exactly what we're seeing with the Lord of the Rings of Power season 2. Now, I can't really express that clearly enough, but we all see the devil in the details and stuff. And they're not going to stop with this. The showrunner's not going to stop with this. The actors and actresses are going to keep themselves portrayed as activists rather than entertainers, okay? And they've actually admitted it themselves. So we're going to go ahead and continue to watch this show dive in a deep dumpster fire that it is. So let me know your thoughts about this in the comments below. Also, be sure to include any additional thoughts when I have this particular topic. If you enjoyed what I shared in this video, go ahead and smash the like button and share far wide across social media. And if you haven't done so already and you enjoyed all the content that I put out there, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Click the bell notification so that way you'll be notified of future uploads and updates. Till then, peace.